my children were very interested in what I was doing, and Laura and David Kruskal, who live in Princeton, New Jersey, got me dates to teach at the libraries or the art stores, and I was just fixing one of the exhibitions that I had brought down to Princeton where I had taught. I was bringing it back into my house when the phone rang, and it was a woman called Alice Gray at the Museum of Natural History. And she said she had a problem, and did I have any giraffes? I think it was a giraffe she wanted to learn, because her cousin in Ohio was giving a luncheon to her fellow school teachers and wanted to make a circus with origami animals as a centerpiece, and didn't know how to make all of the animals, and got her cousin Alice Gray, who through an exchange with a Japanese girl she had sent butterflies to a Japanese girl, and the girl had sent her back in exchange a book on origami and had taken the trouble to write the contents in English. And so Alice May, who's an entomologist at the Museum of Natural History and has never had another job in all these 50 years that she's been working and is now retired, became interested in making bugs with paper because of that book. And then when her cousin asked her how to make a certain animal for the circus, she didn't have that animal in the book that was sent to her, and she knew about me, and it was the thing that caused her to call me up one night when I was taking down the exhibition I had brought from Princeton, to ask me if I knew how to make a giraffe or whatever it was. And I said to her, I am just in the act of putting away my exhibition. Perhaps you'd like to come down. I'm particularly anxious, if you're an entomologist, to look at a bug that an artist had made for me, to tell me whether it is exactly what this bug should be. So she said, can I come tonight? And I said, sure, come for dinner. So Alice Gray entered my life, and that was 30-odd years ago or more. And she became an associate in helping me to further the interest in origami, and is now currently the president of the Friends of the Americans of the Society, the Origami Society of America. I should know how to say it, shouldn't I? So Alice looked at my bug and told me it had the right amount of legs and feelers and all the other thing, and she became extremely interested in what I was doing. And I said to her, someday somebody's going to come into my life that'll tell me what to do with all these wonderful models that I have. Badgie was bringing them into me by the brown bag full once a week. And when I'd say, Mr. Badgie, what'll I do with them? I have no room for them. So he said, throw them away. And he knew that I could never throw them away. He knew that was... So for years I had big boxes filled with his models, and he was so prolific. He could fold anything and everything. So Alice came to be my friend and took over the editorship of the little paper that I'd gotten out, because when I started my first meeting, my first origami meeting, I thought there were people who wanted to know what I was doing, people that I knew intimately and that were interested in my work. So I started a little paper called The Origamian, and told who was there and what we had folded. And that little Origamian went through several editors before Alice said she would take it over. And through Alice, it grew to be a much looked for piece of news in some people's lives, because it told about new books and new models and the people who were interested, and was a means of my making my first convention. I had about 35 people come from quite a distance the first year in my own home, and served 3 meals a day for the weekend. And that was the first convention. I held a convention in my home for several years before Michael made it such a big thing that I no longer could seat everybody. And now we're expecting hundreds and hundreds of people for our meeting, our convention in June. He's given 10 conventions, I think, one bigger than the other. And origami has grown to be known and loved. In fact, it's now in the dictionary, which surprised me very much. When the Cooper Hewitt Museum put on the exhibition of origami, the first exhibition of paper folding in the country, they really did a beautiful job, and they gave a catered lunch. And I found sitting next to me a man by the name of Martin Gardner, who was the editor of the mathematical column for the Scientific American for many, many years. He's now retired. And naturally, we conversed during the luncheon. He had just seen something that I had done for a young man who wanted to write a book on origami, because he had invented quite a few models. And he had said to me, if I sit at my typewriter, Lillian, will you give me your directions for making the flapping bird? Which I did. And later on he said to me, I had to delete a few words because when I read it, it sounded so funny when you said push, 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 when I was describing after you fold the paper how you just push it and get it all to snap in a certain way. Anyway, he said if I had seen Sam Randler's book before, I had been asked by my magazine to write a description of how to make that bird, and mine doesn't compare to your description. I'm sorry that I didn't know that you had it in print somewhere, or I would have used your description. And he was responsible, Martin Gardner, for introducing me to Rigney, a little 80-year-old man, Irishman, at that time that I met him, and that was about in the late 50s. He said, I want you to meet him because he did the drawings for the book that Dover published. Martin Gardner was responsible for Dover publishing that book because, you see, they are a reprint house. And he told them that they should reprint that book. And they changed the title because it was out of print from Fleming, who had done it originally in hardcover. And it was called Fun with Paper. And they changed it to Paper Folding for the Beginner. Now that was a very fortuitous name, because anybody who's studying anything usually wants to have the beginning book on it, which really isn't necessary in the case of origami, because every book that's ever been printed on paper folding starts with a simple model and goes to as difficult a model as the author knew. So any book will teach you how to paper fold if you still start at the beginning, not at the back as so many people do. When they open a book, they turn it to the back and flip through it. So that was how Martin Gardner became a friend of mine, having met him at the luncheon. And he saw to it that I met Mr. Rigney, who was 80 years old then, and he told me how the book was published. He said that a young man by the name of Murray had been for a short time in Japan and had come back with a few models that the geisha girls had entertained him with, because that was part of their culture, to entertain their guests with singing, dancing, and origami. And he thought they were so unusual, so Fleming, when they published it, had on their staff Rigney to do the pictures and the illustrating, because he had done all of the Boy Scout books, and he knew a lot of the riddles and things of interest, puzzles and things that would be of interest to boys. So when he received this assignment to publish a book, to do the artwork for it, there was so little in the book to fill it out. It was such a small, thin book that he filled it out by putting in some of the puzzles that he had published in the Boy Scout book. That's why there are things that are cut with paper, puzzles and things in the book, and it explains why it isn't all paper folding, just paper folding. And Murray and Wrigley was such a darling little fellow, and I didn't know that he had the same specialty as Mr. Badgie. So I thought, wouldn't it be wonderful to introduce these two men who both use their scissors so well? So I had Mr. and Mrs. Wrigley up for dinner and invited Badgie and Martin Gardner and his wife in my penthouse in Gramercy Park, where I lived. And when they sat down and we were just about to serve hors d'oeuvres, Mr. Wrigley took out his scissors and immediately started to, while we were chatting and talking, unobtrusively do a little cutting. And all of a sudden he opened it up, and it was a barnyard scene with a fence and all the little animals coming up. Something like when you open up, you cut several thicknesses of paper and there are dolls, each holding hands, something like that, only there were many more complicated things in it. And I thought it would be so thrilling to bring these two men together. When I did, it was a complete failure. Badgie refused to bring his scissors out. Wrigley sat with his hands in his lap. It was such a terrible evening for me when I realized that two men I thought would get together so well, and they didn't. Neither of them cut for the other. So, excuse me. Way back when I started the Origami Center, there were many unusual and delightful things that happened as a result. People would write to me and say, I've been doing origami all my life in my little ballywick and never knew anybody else did it. I'm so thrilled to hear that there's a center. And that happened in many cases and in very far away places. One day I got a letter from a Samuel Randlett from Fisk University. I had no idea what position he occupied or anything about him, but and I can't remember the city or the state that Fisk University is located at, but I know that it's an important university, and I think it's a black university down south. So I didn't know who Mr. Sam Randlett was, and he wrote and told me of his great interest in origami. And as it happened, when I married Harry, he always made a trip, one of his big trips across country to the other coast on business every year. And I accompanied him because being freshly married and being interested in people, and I never wanted to stay home alone, I said, Harry, I'm going with you on any of your trips. So when I found out that Mr. Randlett would like to see me if I came into his town, we made arrangements that we would try to have that happen. And when the time grew near, I told him what Harry's schedule was and when we would be in his town. And he told me that when I got to my hotel, to just let him know, and he and his wife would come down, we'd have dinner together. So the time came, we arrived at the hotel, and I'm sorry that I can't remember the name of the city, excuse me. And Harry went up to take his usual nap before dinner, and I went down in the lobby to see if this couple would be there, and I had no idea what would turn up. Unfortunately, I had not arranged with him that I would wear a red rose or that he would wear a blue scarf or something like that, and it never occurred to me until I went down to the lobby, and it was buzzing with people. Almost every sofa and chair was occupied, and a very busy evening it was indeed. So I thought, how in my life am I going to pick out Mr. and Mrs. Randlett, since I haven't the vaguest idea whether they're going to be black, white, or green? So I stood there in the entrance and looked around in bewilderment, thinking, how in the world am I going to find that couple I'm looking for? When all of a sudden, way off in one of the corners, I see a young man and a young woman, white, sitting there, and on their heads were newspaper hats. So I knew very well that that was my couple, and when I went over there, I thought that was one of the most amusing ways that anybody could meet. And they were a charming young couple, and they just had a little baby. Little Larry, I think, was just a baby, an infant. And we had dinner together, and we were most congenial. And they invited us over to see where they were living. They were housed, incidentally, he was a pianist, which I didn't know. And he was either an instructor or a professor of something in that field in the university. Had nothing to do with paper folding, of course. But they were housed in the attic of one of the fraternity houses. It was a lovely big old house like fraternities usually have, and we went upstairs to the attic, and that they owned the whole, they rented the whole attic, or that was given to them to live in. And there was the little infant, and every year that we went there, we met the Randlets, and I saw Larry grow to be a little fellow, and the second one on the way. But what was interesting was his piano. It was a grand, and it was covered with books and papers and all kinds of things, because he was inventing a new way of practicing for pianists, and I believe he's published a few books in that field. So already he had great standing even as a young man, and he told me that he had about 40 or 50 original models that he had invented, and that his wife, Jean, had done the drawings for them. And he wanted to know if I knew a publisher. Well, I had been approached by, well, I can't tell you the name, one of the fine publishing companies, you would know immediately, to publish a book. But I had promised Shari Lewis that I would write one with her, so I didn't know in my ignorance and innocence that that needn't have stood in my way, that I could have signed up with any other publisher. So I turned them down, but they were very friendly. They had taken me out to lunch and told me exactly what they wanted, kind of a book that would be a sort of a textbook for origami, and they didn't care if it was a bestseller. They wanted something that they could sell every year as new people came up wanting to learn something new. So I suggested him as a possibility, and he got in touch with them, and sure enough, they published his first book, The Art of Origami by Samuel Randlett. I was very proud of it. It was a wonderful book, and Jean did beautiful, simple, easily understood diagrams. So it was really a lovely book. Unfortunately now it's way out of print. And I was so proud of him, and he negotiated it all himself. A few years later, they called me up to say, would I look or suggest a second book? I said, have you sold so many of them that you want a second book already? And he said, well, we printed about 4,000 or 5,000, and we've sold quite a few of them. We would like to have a book that just keeps selling a few thousand every year, and that would please us enough. That would be like a textbook. So how would I suggest, Mr. Randlett had 3 suggestions, and what would I think of them? And the first was to take a model, a base, and take it to its very end. Take that base and do everything that could be done with it. Would be a very interesting book. I turned that down right away, because I know that nobody can ever say that they have done everything that can be done with a base. Because in my own innocence, as I got to be more sophisticated in this beautiful art form, I realized that I was asked to do an encyclopedia once, and I turned it down for that reason, because every day there was somebody writing into me, has this ever been done before, enclosing a model, and I'd never seen it before. I thought that after many years, there was nothing more that could be done with a square of paper. I had seen so many, but you know, I keep getting them. People send in models that I never dreamed could be made, just by turning the paper one way or another, turning it inside out, or turning it around and seeing something, other possibility in the paper. So I realize now that, and then, that one could never have an encyclopedia like there is one of knots, and things that, all the knots that have ever been made are known, so you can write a definite book about it. But you can't do that about origami, because today, the origami that we're doing, the English and the American and all the other countries, is so different than the traditional. If you're well steeped in the traditional origami, you realize how this modern world is doing different things. It's the most astonishing thing, what they're doing with origami. So you couldn't sit down and write a definite book about it. So that's why I turned that first thing down. The second suggestion he made was to publish the models of living origami lovers, people who are inventing things right along and never knew that they could. I immediately said that would be the most interesting book, and I think that that's what he should do, and he did it eventually, and it was published, and it was called The Best of Origami. And those 2 books, The Art and The Best, have been two of the most wonderful books in our library, in our literature, from an American's point of view. Jean's drawings were so clear and so easy to understand, and every time we went down to the university and paid a visit to the Randlets, Jean was always involved in swimming lessons and in teaching swimming to the little fellow. I remember one of the last memories I have of her, after we had lunch together one day on one of the visits, was her carrying Larry on her shoulders and going off for a swimming lesson, and the new baby within her. And they had about 4 or 5 children, I'm not sure how many now, before his father died, and he and Jean and the children moved back to Wauwatosa, Wisconsin, where his father's house was ready for him to go into. And then, unfortunately, Jean died, and one of the origami friends who lived up in Seattle by the name of Thelma I met when Harry and I were on one of our trips, and we landed in Seattle, and she had been in correspondence with me, and she came down in the morning, had breakfast with us, and then Harry went off for a day's work, and she and I spent the whole day together for the 3 days that we were in Seattle on Harry's business. And that was how I met Ed Sullivan, who is an engineer and lives in Seattle, not our famous television Ed Sullivan, but a remarkable man who has invented some wonderful, wonderful models. I would never have come across him if it hadn't been for Thelma, who introduced me to him, and as she had a little group working around her in origami in that city, and of course I immediately met them all. Well, she wrote a letter of condolence to Sam when Jean died, and he answered it back, and in no time at all, she had sent him a picture of herself, and he was making a trip up to visit her, and that was one of the beautiful romances that came out of origami, that now she is Mrs. Samuel Randlett. And I think what was interesting in the story, although it had nothing to do with paper folding, was that when he came home to tell his little children that there was going to be a new mommy, the children asked, would she let us have our pets, our little mice? Because when Jean was alive, and Harry and I had visited the Randletts where they lived in the attic of this big house, the mice would come, and there were lots of mice in the attic, and the children loved them. They played with them, and the parents were broad-minded enough to allow them to have a few as pets. It isn't everybody that would do that. So that was important to the children. The only thing they asked, will the new mommy let them have their pet mice? And of course, Thelma was the kind that did. Thelma made a wonderful second mother to those children. She was a grandmother herself, but very young, looking and pretty, attractive. And she became a clown, a professional clown, because Randlett, and who had been a magician before he was an origami person. And most origami people, if you scratch them a little bit, will admit that they have done magic in their youth at some time. I too did magic before I ever got into origami, and it's a funny thing. I think they probably are related in a way, because they both attract the public attention and can be a means of entertainment, as well as a great source of contentment and happiness to anyone who can invent and have the privilege of inventing. So Thelma was instructed by her husband in the magic that he remembered, and she made quite a career for herself. At the moment she isn't well, so I don't want to mention the fact that she isn't performing anymore, but she had dozens of jobs every day to go out to, and she was the funniest clown and loved doing origami with the children. Everyone got a flapping bird with her logo on it, and she was a great success in her field, and the youngest grandmother that you can imagine. So that was a very interesting story of how I met the Randletts. And Sam is, I believe, in the throes now of writing a paper folding book on money folding. He's very interested in the wonderful folds you can make from a dollar bill. Since it's illegal to in any way cut, tear, or mar legal tender. You really have to be a purist, because we can fold a dollar bill and you can open it up and it has not been harmed in any way, just simply it increases, that's all, and it increases. And you can open up everything we fold and show it. So we are proving our point that you can make all these wonderful figures without cutting, pasting, or using clips or any of the other methods that paperwork involves. And he is writing a book on money folds, which is a very popular thing among folders, because so many of them have learned how to make the ring that a bartender often makes. He makes a ring, a simple ring out of a dollar bill, where the one comes out as the jewel, where the jewel would ordinarily be. And the bartenders are known to make many other things. In fact, three of our most important members, the three Schall brothers, David, Don, and Michael. Michael, of course, is the soul and spirit of the Friends of the Origami Center of America. He's the one that has taken all the young people and gotten the legal title of not for tax-free, tax-exempt, not-for-profit as an educational, and he has taken my whole collection and found a lovely home for it in the office of Alice Gray, the entomologist who's retired. And these three boys, well, their father was responsible for their interest, because their father, Herman, would come down to me once a month to my folding sessions when I lived in the village in West 11th Street. And when he came home after having that treat of meeting with a lot of people who were all interested in folding, he would take his three boys and teach them what he had learned. And Michael says that he was very strict, and if they didn't fold neatly, they got it. I can't believe it, because Herman was such a quiet, peace-loving man, but he might have been a strict father. But he was interested and would be so thrilled now to know that his three boys are each in their own way so actively involved in origami, because they showed no sign of it at that age, at the early age. But I keep wandering, so I must go back to tell you that I wanted to tell you more about the Randlets, because Skillman and another famous man, whose name will come to me later, used to go out to the Randlets and have weekends of pure joy folding together and teaching Thelma any of the tricks, the magic tricks that they knew to make her profession more important. And she really did absorb a lot from these men who had the experience and wanted to give her everything that they knew. And they used to meet for weekends in Wisconsin at their home and have many wonderful sessions. Mr. Skillman, I would like to tell you about him, because he was one of the nicest black men I have ever met. I met him also through Harry's trips, these trips out west, because the first stop would be Chicago. And in Chicago, I had both a son and daughter and their families living there. So my visits to Chicago were very important to me. And I can't recall, probably because Skillman wrote to me like so many people did, and of course when I ever went to a city, I always looked up what paper folders lived there so that we could meet and have a bash together. So Mr. Skillman was very important when I was in Chicago, because he knew the Chicago folders that he had met by accident. And we're all beginning to pull together and draw together. So that was so exciting for me. As I had started the Origami Center of America, it was so exciting to think that wherever we went, there might be little groups meeting that would eventually get together and make an international society. So Mr. Skillman, I believe, had some sort of work with the postal office, postal position, I'm not sure what it was, but it was a white-collar job. And he was a charming man. We met, and he took me and introduced me to Aiko. Aiko is a Japanese who still has a shop in Chicago selling fine art papers and art supplies, and she carried origami paper. And she was wonderful to meet and very kind, and she used to, every Christmas, send me a $5 bill as a contribution to my running the Origami Center of America. I really didn't need it, but I couldn't insult her by sending it back. But I thought it was so sweet of her to want to encourage our efforts with origami. Also, Mr. Skillman said one day to me, I would like you to meet a friend of mine who's a young student in the seminary studying religion. I imagine it wasn't Buddhism. I imagine that he is a religious man in Christianity. But he's a young fellow and Chinese. His people live in Philippines. He came here from the Philippines. And he's Chinese, and he's very interested in paper folding, and he's done some unusual things. So the next trip through Chicago, I had the good fortune to meet Philip Shen, who was a young fellow. Today, he heads one of the biggest universities in China, and he has kept in close touch with us. He's our very good friend and one of our masters, and everything that he invents is done with little squares of foil, which at one time housed either dried soup or dried something or other. It's that nice heavy foil that you get when some of the companies put their dried soups in soups. And he has made such beautiful stars and so many wonderful models and keeps on inventing and has, when I took Alice over to, on our trip around the world, the first time I took her abroad, we were invited by Mr. and Mrs. Shen to visit them at the new college, which was right on the border of Hong Kong and China. We took a train out to that outlying district, and of course he had two sons, and we knew them from the time they were born. And he usually pays a visit every year to America. He comes in either to a convention or to see one of his two sons who are very prestigious scholars, and college is very important in their field because this father and mother are brilliant, both in technical world, and the two boys are living up to their parents' heights as far as intellectual goes. So Mr. Shen, Dr. Shen, always had somewhere to show his beautiful models, an exhibition. Every year he put up an exhibition in the college where he was, and he's kept up with all of us throughout the world because he travels quite a bit, and we see him perhaps once every year or two, and that is such a delight to think that over the years the few origami people that we met originally are still so interested in keeping this personal contact, which is valuable to me above all things.
Tape's rolling. Sounds good. Go ahead.
One of the very important companions of these weekends, these paper folding weekends in Wisconsin with Sam and Thelma and Mr. Skillman and a few other people, was a very important man.
J. Marshall.
His name is very familiar to magicians. His name is J. Marshall, and he and Francis run the biggest magic store in the West in Chicago called Magic Incorporated. And J. Marshall is a very distinguished entertainer, very much in demand as an MC when any group is having a convention or a meeting, because he's extremely witty and the most wonderful magician I've ever seen. He does the linking rings in a fashion such as is unbelievable. And that, of course, is the least of his endeavors, I should say. But also is a paper folder and has his own routine, which he can entertain you with a piece of newspaper, making a lot of different hats, one from another, and finally ending up in a burst of laughter from the whole audience. Now, it happened that at one time early in my marriage with Harry, I became interested in finding out what ventriloquism was. All my life I've been thwarted by the idea of anybody being able to throw his voice into a barrel or a drawer. And I was always frustrated because I couldn't picture how that could possibly be done. But I also gave myself a restriction. I wanted to earn the money for the course of lectures. When I met Shari Lewis, I asked her if she thought that a person of my age could, let's see, I must have been all of 56 or 7, something. I thought I was very old. If I thought that a person of my age could learn to do ventriloquism, and she assured me that she thought it was an excellent thing, and many of her friends who were retired had taken it up, and it was ideal for that because you just had your doll to carry, you had your ventriloquial figure to carry, and nothing was demanded of you very much as far as skill goes, like you do have to have in magic. You have to have skillful fingers to be a magician, and you could be an entertainer, and it would be a wonderful hobby for your old age. So Jay Marshall, of course, is clever in anything when it comes to entertaining. He came and picked up my ventriloquial figure one day. I'm skipping all over that about how I got to be one, and picked it up and made him talk such as I've never seen or heard from my young little boy that I had. Because when I did study it and I did earn the $150 for my course of 10 lessons, and she did recommend the only certified teacher in New York that she knew about, Monsieur Brunard, and I did take my 10 lessons with him, and I earned the money myself, which was probably a silly thing, but I took a job at Macy's and showed the crowd how to fold, how to make bows with ribbons, and it was a Christmas season, and I did exceedingly well for Macy's. I sold out the stock in no time and almost lost my voice in doing it, giving one show after another. I was not allowed to teach the audience, the customers, but I could do anything I wanted as far as using the ribbon to make bows or roses. I made beautiful roses with them, and I could give them right away to anyone that I wanted to, but I was not allowed to teach. And one day, after the crowd had dispersed, a man came from the outer rim of the crowd and introduced himself as belonging to a Chicago printed ribbon, a very large concern whom I worked with as I sold the ribbon. I sold their ribbons. What's the word you use when you're a demonstrator, or maybe there's another name for it. And I was doing it for them, and he said he belonged to them, and he just came in for Chicago to catch my pitch. And he said, "You're the most professional one we've ever had." And I had to laugh because I'd never done it before. But it shows how much I enjoy doing it, and I earned $150, although I had it myself, and Harry would have been glad to give it to me, but it's just one of those things you put yourself to. Now, this goes back to Jay, because I think I mentioned that we were 5 of us that corresponded originally in origami, and one of them, besides, one of them was Gershon Legman, an American expatriated who lived in the south of France, and really was the one that gave us all a start in our picking up knowledge about who was doing origami in what country and where, because he was compiling limericks. They had to be pornographic, but they came from all over, and he called it folk art, or folk, because you find these things in little groups of people. They're not ordinarily brooded about, and he had written to everyone he knew in every country of the world, trying to collect limericks. So he brought us Lillian Montoya in South America, who was a Spanish woman, and who was a very remarkable young woman at the time. She did all of the drawings for a very famous Spanish man, and I think to get his name right, I'd rather wait and tell it in a little while, who published many books in Spanish and never gave her any credit for any of the work she did. But when Legman wrote to South America, to Argentina, to one of his professors or co-patriarchs or what, he received word that they didn't have any limericks, but he knew of this young girl who did these wonderful things with paper and was doing the drawings for this Spanish author. And so Lihia came into one of our groups that were corresponding together and trying to gather enough origami models and interest to satisfy us. Robert Haben through Gershon Legman. Gershon Legman knew Akira Yoshizawa, who was the master in Tokyo in Japan, who had 20 or 30,000 original models and had already published. And then through Gershon Legman we met Lydia Montoya, and she became one of the group, and she sent many of her original models to all of us, and they were made out of very, very thin airmail paper, not tissue paper, stronger than that, and very easily folded tight and can be put into a letter and sent without any difficulty. So all her letters contained some of her original models. And this was how Robert Haben was able to make his first book, Paper Magic, such an interesting book for the scholar, because he printed whatever he could find out about the beginnings of origami in Japan. And there's practically nothing written. And everybody who tries to do research and even goes to the Library of Congress comes up across something that is very funny. Gershon Legman put out a little pamphlet, and he put the books that he knew about, printed them. It was this little tiny pamphlet, and in the foreword he has pre-printed by, and of course pre-printed is no word, we usually say reprinted from something, but he's a great jokester with words and fools everybody, and he put in this little book of his pre-printed. Well, you read it quickly, you don't think for a moment that that's not the proper word, and I remember when a young man who today is one of our greats, who brought me the little pamphlet and told me that he has been down to Washington to the Library of Congress and he can't find anything on origami. Of course, there was nothing. There is nothing that any one of us could ever get a hold of. There was no mention of the word origami in Japanese literature until the 1800s. I don't know if I mentioned that before. But Alice Gray had read in a book, and I don't believe it was the book called Pillow Talk, but it's another famous book that everybody knows about, that one of the noble ladies who, in one of her discouraging moments in writing verse, of course this young noble lady was being trained in all the court graces in painting and art, literature and everything, and she was a poet. And she wrote one day that her muse has deserted her, and in her anger and annoyance, she took her paper that she was writing her poetry on and tore it up and made a paper house. Now that is one of the first notices of any such thing as little thing as that in the literature. And yet we know that the court's nobles had paper because China had just invented it about 1,000 years ago, and it was very expensive, but some of that beautiful paper had been brought over, and only the court people had the opportunity to take the advantage of using it and having some of it. I'm getting far afield, I'm sorry. So J. Marshall was leading a convention in the Catskills about the time that my husband was taking, and I were taking one of these cross-country trips on business, and one of the first stops was in the mountains there, and I saw from the Tanner flyer that there was a convention going on in a neighboring town, a 3 or 4 day convention, and that J. Marshall was going to be MC. Now he was the only one I knew besides Robert Haben who knew Gershon Legman, and he is such an unusual figure in our world, in our origami world, and has contributed so much to it because he personally knew Yoshizawa in Tokyo and knew more about origami than any of the five of us, and was very nice in telling Robert Harbin what he knew. Unfortunately, the book had already gone to print, so he could not take everything that he wanted to take and put it in, but he did as much as he could. That's why the book is not a beautiful book to look at from, perhaps from a publisher's point of view, but it has more information in it than anyone, and we had never had a book.
Which book?
The paper folding, Robert Harbin's first book was called Paper Magic. I have a volume of it reprinted. It's been reprinted many, many times, and I really should have it in my hand to show you. And his introduction gave the most that any of us knew about origami because Gershon Legman was able to tell him, because Gershon had written around the world for his limericks and had come across the work that Lihia was doing with this very fine Spanish man. And the Spanish man I'd like to tell you about because he was an important author at the time of many books on origami. So many careers, having been a violinist and a dentist, and now had turned his offices and in his home into a sort of a museum. And he had many glass cases filled with the most beautiful models I'd ever seen. And the interpreter went around with me, and we marveled at many of the things. He wanted to prove to me that he was a purist. Well, we came to a model of a fish that had many fins and long drooping tails, and I couldn't see how that possibly could have come out of a sheet of paper without some cutting. So I mentioned that surely this one was cut, and he said, "Oh, no, 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 no," and spouted a whole lot of Spanish, which the interpreter let me know meant that he never cut. But he took out of his pocket a tiny little penknife, which he opened up and said, "I never use the scissors." So he told me he didn't cut, but here was this little penknife that he admitted he used when he did origami. So you see, he wasn't the purist he thought he was, but it didn't matter to me, and I was very much amused to think that he thought he didn't cut. And he entertained me very nicely. His housekeeper brought in tea for us and a little wine and a cookie, and he was very charming man. But I didn't have the good luck to meet Ligia Montoya, whom I'd been corresponding with so long. When she heard that I was coming down to meet her, she couldn't face it. I had the good luck to speak to her mother. I visited her home, and her mother ushered me in, and I had the good luck to see the last Christmas tree that she had decorated for her home, her mother's home. And I was taken into her little room, and I sat on her little bed, a little cot, very sparsely furnished. There was a desk. On the desk was her mail awaiting her return, and I noticed not only an airmail letter from me, but an airmail letter from Robert Harbin too, and one from Gershon Legman, because I had been corresponding with them and knew very well what their envelopes looked like. And yet she didn't have the courage to meet her. She was very much a personal to herself. She could express herself beautifully writing, but she never wanted to be in contact with anyone. And when I heard that she had flown to their summer place, I said, well, maybe I can pick up a little plane and land on the beach. And I did try to do it, but there was no possibility of my being able to land on that little place. I really didn't mean to pursue her, but I was so eager to meet her because we had exchanged pictures at one time in our correspondence, and she had told me that she felt that we did look somewhat alike, because I wasn't able to do any paper folding like she did, but she always wrote very warmly and was very generous in sending me her new models. So, as I say, I had the pleasure of meeting Mr. Solorzano and Dr. Solorzano, and in his office was a framed picture, and it looked like a whole mouthful of teeth, the upper and lower, and every one of those teeth was a paper fold. And it even had one tooth being drawn out with a drop of blood, and that was a little red drop of blood, a little red piece of paper on the picture. He also had the picture of a bullfight with the bull and the toreador, and it was very exciting that he had made out of origami figures. Quite a few lovely pictures like that, and that was really a thrill for me to meet him. But I didn't have much luck when Harry took me to South Africa to meet Margaret Campbell, who wrote the first book that we have printed. I don't know the exact date. I shall get it later. I don't know why I'm talking about South Africa, and I'm not even finished with South America yet. But my thought takes me there to that, where I wanted to meet Margaret Campbell, and got there too late. She was a woman in her 90s and had passed away. And before Harry and I went down to South Africa, we stopped in at Portugal, where her son, who was a very well-known poet, lived in Portugal, and we thought we could meet him before we went down to see his mother. And we had arrived too late then, because the year previous to that, this fellow had been killed in a motorcycle. So we hadn't much luck in that part of our trip. But in Argentina, we did have a great deal of luck in meeting Solorzano and in visiting Ligia Montoya's home and actually sitting in her little room and talking to her mother. And the mother was telling us how she was a very quiet girl, never had any friends, but she was the strong one in the family. Everyone in the family had a duty to do, and she took the duty of cooking for the little family. But when the piano was being moved, when they moved and the men couldn't get the piano through the window into the little house, she got up there and showed them how she could do it for them. So mother was telling me through the interpreter how strong she was and what a clever girl she was. So that was, she had all her models. The sister, when she died, the sister who was married and had a family and who lived there, told me that wrote to me that all of her models were put in a large trunk and sent down to her summer place. And I had wanted, Alice Gray and I had talked about the possibility of trying to get that trunk full of original Montoya paper models up here somehow to put them on exhibition. But we were never able, not being able to talk Spanish, we never were able to get the confidence of the sister to assure her that we would take care of them, because these should be seen by everyone in the world interested in origami, because her models were so very beautiful. However, when I was invited to do the first origami exhibition at the Cooper Union Museum, Ligia was one of them that sent me so many of her beautiful original models, and they did exhibit them there, and we have pictures to prove it. Before I leave J. Marshall, I want to tell you some things about him. I want to take you back to where Harry and I were on a trip, and Harry gave me permission to leave him for a night to go to the next little town and spend one day at the convention, because there was one whole morning devoted to ventriloquism. And so many magicians are ventriloquists too, and they all had brought their dummies with them. And I wanted to be part of that, and I particularly wanted to meet Jay, because I wanted to ply him with questions about this wonderful and unusual character of Gershon Legman, who resided in the south of France and whom I had never met. So I did go over to the convention, and I did meet Jay, and he was most kind about talking to me and giving me many examples of Gershon Legman's peculiar humor, which isn't always funny to us. And I did spend the day with the ventriloquists, and I couldn't get over thinking how silly it was that all the dummies were saying hello to one another and saying how good to see them after the last year, the year before, where they had all met together at another convention, and here they were meeting now and talking about Little Willie and Little Johnny, and I couldn't help feeling how silly it was. I never did anything after that in ventriloquism. You get a different viewpoint. But I must say that Jay was wonderful, and has been, whenever I've met him at festivals, and we've been to many festivals together because he's always sought after to be MC. And it was a great honor to me when he came into New York and would come to visit me in Gramercy Park, where Harry and I lived. He once took us to an auto show in which he was doing the linking rings every 15 minutes. I guess you can't imagine anything more boring to a magician to go through this. But I'm sure he was handsomely paid for it, and he really astounded everybody in what he did.
Worry about saying things you don't want to say. Okay.
I must come back to Gershon Legman and speak about him because he was such a valuable contact to us. He knew Yoshizawa and had some of his works and even taught some of Yoshizawa's models at a session in a city in Holland because he has a picture of himself and the little children grouped around him in great awe and pleasure in being taught simple origami. And so we're really responsible for so many things that Gershon Legman has done, and he is a very respected author in his own right. And he did come to America several times, and I had the pleasure of not only meeting him, but offering him hospitality. I gave several dinner parties to which he invited all of his friends, because he was only going to be in New York a short time, and I was able to give him the availability of meeting him and that he could meet all his friends comfortably here. He knew professors and important people in every country in limericks that he was able to get in touch with people who might know of paperwork. And they even want to claim that they might have started the interest, but I think he was a professor and who himself invented quite a few paper folds and wrote certain tracts on origami from his position as being a professor. Because when we gave our first exhibition at Cooper Union, one of the invited guests was the daughter of Professor Unamuno, who no longer, and she had many of his paper things in her possession. And she told us a little bit at the luncheon about her father and his interest in paper folding, and took a napkin and made 2 or 3 twists and turns, and there was this beautiful chicken with a little head. A knot of the corner of the napkin made the head, and then a big knot made the body, and the tail was another corner coming out. It was very charming and easily, quickly made, and she drew a round of applause from that. So, but he had written some very serious tracts on his paper folding, and these can be found in libraries. But you'll never find Mr. Legman's pre-printed issue, because Deg Farrelly came to me once. Deg Farrelly is now one of our big paper folders. He's head of a library in Pennsylvania. And he came to me to get his, when he was getting his degree, to write his thesis. He wrote his thesis on paper folding and came to my library to do some work in research to get his degree. And we immediately fell in love. I think he's one of the most charming young men that I've ever met. And I threw the whole place open to him, and he did whatever he wanted to do to get his degree. And he kept up his friendship with me, and he knows how fond I am of him. And Deg Farrelly had... your head is in the way, I think.